I've said my piece on AI use in software development plenty of times, but the TLDR is when it comes to these big public models, your GPTs and things like that, there are absolutely still long-running license issues when it comes to using that code. You can't just take GPL and MIT and BSD and all of these other licenses and just mash them all together and then not have any concerns there with certain use cases. And I think a lot of the companies are either just feigning ignorance. We don't know there's a problem here. There's no issue here whatsoever. It's totally fine to use this code. Or they are fully aware of the problem and just pushing it further and further down the line, trying to make as much money as possible and hoping somebody else deals with it. But for specialized trained models on known safe datasets, I think there is definitely going to be some value there, but I think the real value is in what we were already using these tools for long before LLMs. Categorization. And in fields like medicine for early diagnosis, this is showing some really great results. And I think for that field, amazing. If we can find people with cancer 6 months, a year earlier, that is a net good thing. But today we're here to talk about AI and the Linux kernel, but not just about AI-generated code. So back in July, this RFC was made by /11 in the LKML. Add AI coding assistant configuration to the Linux kernel. This patch series adds unified configuration and documentation for AI coding assistants working with the Linux kernel codebase. As AI tools become increasingly common in software development, it's important to establish clear guidelines for their use in kernel development. Now, this isn't guidelines for the use of AI. This is guidelines for the AI for how it should work within the kernel, how it should generate kernel code, how it should generate commit messages, the format it should be working with, how it should be crediting things, and, generally configuration for the tool. How does that work? Well, basically a canned prompt. How well does that work in reality? Sometimes, until it doesn't. This series consists of 2 patches. The first patch adds unified configuration files for various AI coding assistants: Claude, GitHub Copilot, Cursor, Codium, Continue, Windsurf, and Ada. These are symlinked to a central documentation file to ensure consistency across tools. The second patch adds the actual rules and documentation that guide AI assistants on Linux kernel development practices, including following kernel coding standards, respecting the development process, properly attributing AI-generated contributions, and understanding licensing requirements. And down here is just an example of how it works and how you might use and all of that good stuff if it's something you actually want to get involved in using. You'll notice that a lot of the things we talk about today regarding AI use do come from /11. Now, unlike in the Linux desktop space, where there seems to be a lot of people vehemently opposed to AI use, it seems a lot more people in the kernel space, at least those who've been getting involved in the discussion, are a bit more sort of middling on the topic. Now, there are absolutely people that do not want this anywhere near the kernel and do not want this anywhere near their subsystem, and we will get to those people. Now, there are a number of comments under the RFC, but I think we should move over from the RFC to the patch that was made instead, again, from /11. Here is a reply from David Hildebrand, who is kind of apprehensive over doing this. I want to have it clearly spelled out that if you're submitting AI-generated code that you don't fully understand and have reviewed in detail, then you are going to have a real bad time around here. I don't have time to talk to an AI chatbot through email when reviewing patches, because the submitter doesn't understand what he is doing and blindly copy-pastes my replies to the AI. This must not be the new mechanism to DOS kernel maintainers with AI slop, similar to what has been happening over in the kernel community with a lot of the security reports being AI generated and just being a waste of time, because they've gotten to the point where a lot of them are good enough that you can't immediately write them off. So you have to actually read it and then realize, this is garbage. And from Greg Kroll-Hartman, I will note that we are already getting this kind of slop today, with the numbers going up on a weekly basis. Be lucky if you haven't seen it in your subsystem yet. This is already something the kernel is dealing with. The concern, though, is if you have guidelines for the use of AI tools and guidelines for configuring these AI tools, what you're effectively doing is advertising the fact that you do accept these AI contributions now. And they've always accepted them. I'll get more into that in a bit. But if you have a clear documentation saying, this is how we use AI, that tells the AI people that you are actually accepting this. And this is also a problem raised by Lorenzo Stokes. Hi, Sasha. I feel like we need to take a step back here and consider some of the non-technical consequences of this change. Firstly, there is no doubt whatsoever were this series to land, there would be significant press which would amount to, whether you like it or not, Linux kernel welcomes AI patches. I don't feel that a change of this magnitude, which is likely to have this kind of impact, should be RFC'd quietly and then after a weekend, submitted ready to merge. This change, whether you like it or not, amounts to, or at the very least certainly will be perceived to be, kernel policy. And as far as I know, we don't have an AI kernel policy doc yet. So to me, we should establish an official kernel AI policy document. This should be discussed at the Maintainers Summit before proceeding. In addition, it's concerning that we're explicitly adding configs for specific commercial products. This might be seen as an endorsement, whether intended or not. Now, as for the policy document, this is something noted outside of the kernel community as well with this article from ZDNet. AI is creeping into the kernel, and official policy is needed ASAP. This is actually a really good piece, and I would highly recommend you go read it. I generally like ZDNet, and this is a good example of ZDNet actually doing something good. Now, there actually is a policy document being worked on. It's just not something officially announced yet. So the first draft should be presented sometime later this year at the Linux Plumbers Conference in December from the 11th to the 13th. This is being written by Stephen Rosd and various other people in the kernel community. So currently the kernel does technically implicitly have AI policy, it's just not from the project itself. Right now they are operating under the Linux Foundation policy, guidance regarding use of generative AI tools for open source software development. It's a very short and very generic and not really well-defined policy. Basically, the TLDR is assuming the TOS of the tool that you are using allows the code to be used, and the code you're using has the correct license to be used within the kernel or any other project you're involving with, it's fine. Now, the licensing one is a big issue that hasn't really been answered and is probably not going to be answered for a very long time because it very much depends on jurisdiction. And this is what Sasha Levin, who's been spearheading the initiative, has to say. We are basically implicitly already following this guideline, so technically we already agree to allow AI-generated contributions. Now, whether different subsystems are going to accept those contributions, that's going to very much depend on the subsystem, and very much depend on the quality of the code. Regarding the legal issues, though, on our end, one of the reasons the kernel is part of the Linux Foundation is to tackle exactly this. None of us are lawyers, but luckily we have lawyers and resources on our side to help us navigate these challenges. I'd like to think there's no conflict of interest within the Linux Foundation, and their opinion on this matter best represents their clients, both the Linux kernel as well as Linus's best interests. Well, do I think the Linux Foundation has any conflicts of interest with AI tooling? Surely not. Surely there's surely no one's involved in funding the Linux Foundation that is very heavily invested into this tooling. Surely there's no conflict of interest there. None at all. Now, all jokes aside, even if the Linux Foundation sets a policy for Linux Foundation projects in general, that doesn't mean the Linux kernel can't have their own internal policy. So they can make some generic policy where they're like, we love AI, everything should use AI, and then if a project says, well, we don't actually want to do that, they're not forced to accept that code. Now, whatever direction things end up going, whether they accept AI code or don't accept AI code or have configuration for AI tools within the kernel files, one thing is very important. Having a document like this is not, in my view, optional, as in an AI policy. We must have a clear stated policy, and one which ideally makes plain that it's opt-in, and maintainers may choose not to take these patches. I'm not at all a fan of having a small entry hidden away in the submitting patches doc. This is a really major issue that needs special consideration and whose scope may change over time, so a dedicated document seems more appropriate. This shouldn't be an addendum to some other document where it might be missed somewhere. It needs to be a clear AI policy document that is impossible to miss. Sasha replies by saying, I wouldn't trust LLM with anything more than mechanical transformations or test writing at this point. The purpose of this series is not to create new LLM policy, but rather try and enforce our existing set of policies on LLMs. Right now, the official policy of our project is that we accept agent-generated contributions without any requirements beyond what applies to regular humans, which most LLMs promptly skip reading and go do their own thing. So I wanted to at least force LLMs to go RTFM before writing code, and that's a good goal to have. However, I do agree with Lorenzo that before anything involving AI configuration policy should be done, a policy for the use of AI should be laid out. So once you have that configuration for how AI can be used, you already have that guideline for what you're even accepting in the first place. Especially so because things are going to go wrong. And Lorenzo is a maintainer who does a fair bit of review, so when something goes wrong, he is one of the people that's going to have to deal with the fallout of that problem. And not just him, there's a bunch of other people who are doing review, and when this inevitably goes wrong, because it will, because these tools are not perfect, someone's going to have to deal with that. Just look at projects like Kernel. They get tons of AI-based commits and bug reports that are absolute garbage, and the kernel gets the same, likely to a far, far larger scale. And that's without explicitly talking about AI contributions, explicitly saying they accept it, explicitly having any guidelines around AI use. Once you have that, then you open the floodgates. Then you say, we're accepting this, you're allowed to do this, go wild. And you're gonna have people that try to act in good faith and use these tools in a productive way. And then you're going to have people that just want to have a commit in the kernel and are going to do anything they can do to do it and create a waste of time for everyone. I'm not completely against having this tooling be around. I don't think that's the direction things are going to end up ever going. But I think that if we are going to be using these, they have to be done in a very careful way, and they have to be brought in a very slow, intentional process so as not to waste a lot of people's time. But all of this so far has just been about AI-generated code, and that's not the only way these tools can be used, and this is not the only way the tools actually are being used. So going back to that article from earlier, the AI is creeping into the Linux kernel and official policy is needed ASAP. From Sasha Levin at his speech during the 2025 Open Source Summit, large language models LLMs are just another fancy compiler. Back in the 50s and 60s, everyone was working in assembly, and then C showed up, and we didn't stop coding in assembly because C was suddenly perfect. C isn't perfect, but we stopped doing it because C is good enough, and we're more productive coding in C. And to me, LLMs are a similar trade-off. They're not perfect yet, but at some point they'll be good enough to make us more productive. As you can probably tell, Sasha is quite bullish on AI. That's not to say AI isn't already useful. Levin cited an example of a tiny upstream patch to git resolve in the 6.16 Linux kernel. This tool resolves incomplete or incorrect IDs, a small but annoying issue for top maintainers. Levin used AI to write the entire routine. The only thing I did there was to review the code and actually test it to make sure it works. This is a great example of what LLMs are doing right now. You give it a small, well-defined task, and it goes and does it. This is a great example of what LLMs are doing right now. You give it a small, well-defined task, and it goes and does it. and you notice that this patch isn't, hey, LLM, go write me a driver for my new hardware. Instead, it's very specific. Convert this specific hash to use our standard API. Levin said another AI win is that for those who are not native English speakers, it also helps with writing good commit messages. It is a common issue in the kernel world where sometimes writing the commit message can be more difficult than actually writing the code change, and it definitely helps there with language barriers. I don't think these tools are amazing at handling commit messages in general. However, if you know what you want to write as a commit message, but you're not fluent in the language, it can be a nice bridge between those two. But if you're trying to get it to write the entire commit message from nothing, you're probably gonna get nonsense. LLMs could be good Linux maintainer helpers. We can teach AI about kernel-specific patterns. We show examples from our codebase of how things are done. It also means that by grounding it in our kernel codebase, we can make AI explain every decision, and we can trace it to historical examples. In addition, he said that LLMs can be directly connected to the Linux kernel Git tree, so AI can go ahead and try and learn things about the Git repo all on its own. But that is mostly for the future. What about how it is being used today? So there is already a tool that exists called AutoCell. Again, from Sash 11, modern AI-powered Linux kernel stable backport classifier. I am pleased to announce the release of AutoCell, a complete rewrite of the stable kernel patch selection tool that Julia Lorwell and I presented back in 2018. Unlike the previous version that relied on word statistics and older neural network techniques, AutoCell leverages modern, large language models and embedding technology to provide significantly more accurate recommendations. AutoCell automatically analyzes Linux kernel commits to determine whether they should be backported to stable kernel trees. It examines commit messages, code changes, and historical backporting patterns to make intelligent recommendations. And the recommendations part is important. It's not just going to go and randomly backport patches. It's going to say, hey, here are patches you should look at. Do something with them. And recently, Phoronix put out an article about this, talking about patches like this one. This is directly from AutoCell, and here is the actual message for it, and here is the LLM-generated explanations, which they do admit may be completely bogus. So you have all of this down here. If you want to go read it, you can go do so, but this is the person who looked at that and said, okay, I'm gonna sign off on this. So this is not a commit that is written by AI. This isn't code written by an AI. This is a commit that was written by a person that is being recommended to be backported by that LLM. James Bottomley, senior Linux kernel maintainer and IBM Research distinguished engineer, explained why this approach is a good use for AI in the LKML. If you think about it, the Git history contains the exact patch path between where the patch was applied and where you want to apply it. That's a finite dataset which LLMs can be trained to work nicely with. Humans don't look at the patch path or use something more broad like a range scan. The AI can be patient enough to actually go over it all. Now, yes, there are issues over in projects like Kernel, but internally within the kernel project, AI tools are one of the things being used to identify bugs. Now, they're not the only thing, right? It's not the only thing and is not fully being relied on, but it's one of those other tools to potentially identify problem areas. Also, AI-based tools are now being used to examine commit messages, code changes, and historical backporting patterns to make intelligent recommendations. And from Dirk Hondel, I believe that many of these tools can be useful in augmenting what a human developer can do. They can simplify routine tasks, they can make you faster when typing, they can help document code. Maybe for formatting, but I really hope you're not documenting the code fully with AI. This is a problem area, but especially with a language like C and with an exceptionally complex code base like the Linux kernel, I believe we are still at the very edge of what these tools are good at. There are absolutely people within the kernel project who are excited about what AI tools can be used for. We're not seeing the replacement of engineers, but the augmentation of engineers' work. Sort of removing some of that boilerplatey stuff that engineers have to do and get them more focused on the actual engineering tasks, using these tools as a way to highlight areas which might be worth looking at, not to say that other areas shouldn't be looked at, but areas which appear to be a problem, and sort of guide you along a better path. I know there are a lot of people who are very, very anti-AI, and I'm sure we're going to see some of those comments in the comment section down below. Please be sure to leave them. But I'm very curious to see how this plan plays out, and if it does continue to work well for the kernel in the long run, what this means for the rest of the software industry. But what do you think? Do you think these tools have a place? Do you use these tools in your daily life as well? I would love to know. So let me know down below. Go subscribe, go like the video if you liked the video, and if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and IA.